3, 2.
Hola.
Hola.
En vivo, Anaí.
Vale. Hola, muy buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí presente en este seminario internacional que vamos a tener de invitadas a dos personas que son muy importantes en el mundo de la inter y transdisciplina. Este seminario va a darse en inglés. Sin embargo, las preguntas las pueden hacer en el link que se está dando en el streaming en YouTube. Puede ser en español o en inglés. Matías y Ángel, nuestros colaboradores, van a estar haciendo la traducción y pasando las preguntas. Well, there is a growing consensus that addressing complex global problems require diversity of knowledges and approaches towards producing a hybrid type of science that includes different ways of knowing and different ways of feeling about our world. From different schools of thought, a diversity of literature and concept have risen with the aim to better understand how we can implement these ideas into practice. These are exciting times in research and more recently in education. Combining disciplines and including non-academics into better understanding complex problems have resulted in conferences, courses, and special issue journals with the possibility to show and disseminate results of how these ideas can happen. Nonetheless, if we look around, how large is this community? What challenges we face and what learnings can we already share from different corners of the world? This is precisely the questions we want to discuss with you today. And we have the great honor of discussing these questions with three academics that have been pushing the boundaries of science in research and education, both in Europe, US, but also in Chile. Along with our experience in the University of Chile, we thank you for your participation in this international workshop on experiences and challenges in research and teaching transdiscipline at higher education, organized by the University of Chile. First of all, our first guest speaker is Josie Chambers. Josie is assistant professor of the Urban Future Studio at the Copernicus Institute, Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Her research broadly examines the politics and implication of multiscalar approaches of co-producing knowledge and transformative governance. In her research, she has developed creative methods for co-producing research, but also teaching. And she created a PhD course on transformative research for sustainability challenges. We are very excited to have you here and learn more about you. Go ahead, Josie.
Great, thanks so much, Anaki, also for the invitation to join all of you. I will just share my screen. And apologies in advance that I'll speak in English. It was kind of borderline whether I could manage Spanish or not, because it has been about 4 years since I've regularly lived in Peru, and I was not completely confident how much felt like my language might be a little bit rusty. So I hope that everyone can follow along okay. Since especially in the question that Angel and Anaki that you posed, you were especially interested in our research groups to understand how our different groups and approaches connect. I thought I would especially focus on this question of how I'm approaching transdisciplinarity, especially in the lens of my new research group, which I've been with for the last 1.5 years, which is the Urban Future Studio at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. So I hope through a bit of that futuring lens that might also add kind of an interesting perspective on transdisciplinarity. And so at the Urban Future Studio, we're especially interested in how the dynamics of capitalism, how that really depends on how we're often so confident about what we think is going to happen in the future. And in fact, so kind of based on how our existing systems and how we see things and how we've problematized things in the past and how we expect trends to keep going into the future, that oftentimes, even though these expectations about the future are quite fictional, we often kind of overly project past trends into the future, which ends up hindering our imagination and really closing down what's possible. And so I'm especially, and also my research group, we're especially interested in how is it exactly that our expectations, both individually, but also collectively as a society, are being flattened and kind of hindering what we can imagine in terms of ways of transforming society. And I think it's especially interesting that in a way, kind of in fiction or in the arts, we actually kind of find this predictability quite boring, and we want to be surprised, and we want our expectations to be pushed in more imaginative ways. But then in real life, we're often really scared by the future being unpredictable. And so I think also part of our work is engaging with the arts and design and more imaginative ways of gathering people and bringing different perspectives together to make people feel a little bit more comfortable with discussing different perspectives and imagining more kind of unpredictable possibilities. And then we're not just a research group that kind of focuses on critique or only kind of revealing dynamics of what hinders change, but we're also really interested in experimenting with different ways of bringing people together to expand our collective imagination and reimagine how we see problems. And I felt kind of a bit unsure about what to focus on for this because there's kind of my past work that hasn't been maybe as explicitly connected to the themes in my current research group where I am. So I thought I'd just kind of, for those who aren't familiar, just kind of briefly touch upon how two major parts of my past work connect to this. And one is this work on co-production, which Anahi mentioned. There's this work here which introduces this concept of co-productive agility for sustainability transformations. And it distinguishes how we often, in transdisciplinary processes, we often kind of tend to step into particular roles where we either pin down too much how we see problems and we just kind of take the solution mentality, which is shown through the hero mode here, or we tend to take the woodpecker mode of really kind of critiquing the ways that people are going about trying to solve challenges. Or we actually often kind of relinquish too much power and we might just further, for example, if we're a researcher and a company comes to us with a question, we might not be critical enough in the way that we engage, and we might kind of be the genie that just furthers that dominant mode with so oftentimes funding being backed by people with more power. So kind of this framework kind of shows the importance of not overly holding too much power as researchers in our role or as members of society, and alternatively not relinquishing too much power and trying to find more agile ways of balancing power across different actors. We kind of share lessons that we've learned from different cases and how, for example, if you're working with some of the most powerful CEOs around the world, or if you're working with Indigenous communities, that necessitates very different considerations for how you might design these sorts of knowledge co-production processes. And I often use co-production in this work instead of knowledge co-production, because it's not only about the kind of knowledge that people are sharing, but also very much the kind of action that's generated already as part of that process. And then this other piece over here, this is a piece that I worked on when I was in Wageningen University before I came to where I currently am. And that was really trying to design a process within a university that recognizes that people take very different approaches to try to connect their research to societal transformation. And so this report shares some of the commonalities across those different perspectives. And it tries to come to some sort of common lessons around our ways of working and what makes our ways of working in research especially powerful for transformation. So I thought I'd just kind of put those up there, but then I'd like to kind of go back to what I'm doing in my current role that focuses more on futures and futuring. Also, can I check maybe just how much time I have left, because I'm not sure quite what time we started. Just want to make sure I don't go on too long. Forget who was tracking that.
9 minutes.
9 minutes left? Okay, perfect, thanks. And so now, currently, I'm kind of bringing that co-production approach into this more explicit focus on imagination and futures. And I think it's important to point out that while kind of there's the one side, this is a kind of an expanded alternative futures cone. And on the one side, myself and my research group were really interested in why is it that when we think about the future, we often kind of narrow our scope for what we think is plausible, when we're often kind of too driven by what has happened in the past. And we tend to project out less transformative futures. And how do we recognize those dynamics that are narrowing possible futures? And then how can we actually expand our collective imagination towards futures that would be more collectively desirable? But then how do we think very critically about how that sort of process is designed? And then this kind of tries to counterbalance that with you can't really take the future seriously or bring that into the present without equally taking the past seriously. And so it's especially important to also kind of look backwards and understand, well, what have been the dynamics in the past that have really narrowed the dominant stories that we tell that feed into how we think about the future and the present? Why have certain interpretations been more hidden or marginalized than others? Where are the points of contestation? And then, of course, there's also the many forgotten past that we don't even really hold still in our collective memory. And so this kind of gives you an idea, hopefully, of the overall approach of trying to kind of reach and engage with both the future, but also the past and how we think about our present moment. And then just to kind of, because I realize this is quite abstract, to give you something a little bit more tangible, we see what I'm kind of calling futuring approaches or ways we engage with the future. We see this everywhere implicitly and also explicitly. So if you look at the IPCC climate change process and some of the outputs there, where they've been modeling the CO2 emissions and kind of possible ways, if we do this or if we do that, then this could change our overall CO2 emissions and the effects of climate change. There are very kind of explicit assumptions there about kind of providing only certain menu of options. And one of these options, in fact, assumes that we have the capability of inventing technology to suck carbon out of the atmosphere that doesn't even exist yet. And that having that option of possible pathways or possible futures then has also been mobilized by even companies like Shell to say that they don't need to do as much now because there is this possibility that technology will be developed and they can kind of push or delay their action. So this is just kind of one example of how the way that we often engage with the future through, for example, modeling can be actually quite kind of constraining in setting out possible courses of action and can even kind of further dominant perspectives. What kind of alternative approaches do we take in the Urban Future Studio? These are just two examples of the many projects. The one on the left is a conference that we recently held on imagining what the world could be like in 2060 if we did kind of manage to address a lot of different issues related to social justice and environmental degradation. And it didn't present a single coherent view of the future, because we also thought that might be kind of problematic to say that this is a blueprint or this is how the future should be, but it was more so from different disciplinary perspectives, scoping out kind of how are they thinking about what an ideal future would be like, and then how can that spark different conversations about what we're actually doing now in the present. So that's one example of that kind of participatory futuring approach that we take. And this other project on the right side, so Carl Flores is a PhD candidate that I'm working with now. And she's looking at how our mapping practices in sustainable development have often been deeply colonial in terms of which values they prioritize and what they exclude. And so she's looking in different island sites. She's trying to better understand what would it actually look like to co-create a mapping practice that's decolonial and that regrounds and prioritizes voices that have been excluded in sustainable development discussions. And how do you also not only engage with that at a local or community site question, but how does that connect to broader conversations around mapping practices, given that's such a dominant approach worldwide? So I hope that kind of gives you some sense of the kind of work that we do. And this is just a bit more of kind of an overview of the Urban Future Studio that we provide. We combine social science, especially from a critical perspective, with transdisciplinary approaches. We often engage with artistic practice, and then are also really kind of questioning the dominant ways of knowing and imagining that we often take for granted. And what does it mean to take a decolonial or post-colonial or to engender imagination in much more culturally sensitive ways. And then if you're curious about much more of the scope of what we work on, you can always also kind of visit our website to check out the many different types of projects. We do also kind of a lot of work around renewable energy from a critical perspective as well. And then I thought I would highlight one particular project that I'm involved in right now, which is we're collaborating with Michael Uwemedimo, and he is, so he founded this Human City project in Port Harcourt. And we're currently working together to experiment with how generative AI as part of a participatory process could actually open up imagination for what sustainable infrastructure could look like in those settings. And it comes from this recognition that so far AI has been very biased towards Western perspectives. And so what would it look like if you actually have a participatory process where people are taking the photos of their own sites and using that to imagine themselves for what they would want their cities to look like? Can they use generative AI to create compelling images more bottom up that then would have kind of more of a policy influence by kind of showing more tangible images of what the city could look like to kind of captivate the attention at a funding or political level to actually start to make some of those changes? Yeah, so I think just to end, some of the key challenges that I see in transdisciplinary work, but also connected to this emphasis on how do we open up our imagination towards the future. I really see it as fundamental to understand how can we connect recognition of unjust pasts and really foreground those past processes, but then not get stuck in the deadlocks or in those interpretations of the problems, and how do we expand imagination towards how things could be completely different. And I do think if we fully go kind of one direction or the other, we're going to be really limited in the kind of transformation we can spark. And also, if you do go towards imagination of futures without recognition of past injustices, that's very dangerous as well, I think, because it becomes a really kind of elite exercise that's disconnected from real, very real historical injustices. A challenge I'm working through is how do you combine more cognitive modes? Like we do really need kind of this cognitive and knowledge and research engagement around what sorts of how things could change, but we often as researchers get too stuck in that sort of mode. So how do you combine the sharpness of that with also these more effective and emotional and relational modes of doing science, and how creativity comes in? And I don't think that's something I'm really kind of, I'd say, struggling with in my work, is what is how to balance those different modes. So also very curious to hear from others. And then how and when to develop shared goals. So often I think we want to pin down, this is the transformation we want too quickly. But then if you keep it so open and emergent, it's also very hard to build action, and you can get stuck in this paralysis and too much kind of reflection and learning that doesn't actually build up to change. So I'm really curious about how do we keep that open enough and democratic enough, but then also allow for the emergence of shared goals and collective action. And then finally, this all kind of, for the role of the researcher, entails a really tricky, increasingly difficult role for science. And where is the boundary of our role? And I think many different valuable transdisciplinary roles. I don't think we can do all of them. So I think it is about understanding a little bit our positionality and the value and limitations of how we seek to connect science to society and connecting our different roles. So that's me. I hope I didn't go too much over time. And I look forward to hearing from the other speakers and also the people involved in the call.
Thank you so much, Josephine. It was a very interesting talk. You left a lot of ideas that were a little bit painful to hear, I have to say, the way we're doing things, but that was part of the conversation. Now I have the honor to introduce our next guest speaker, Narcisa Pricope. Narcisa is originally from Romania. She's a professor in the Department of Earth and Ocean Science at the University of Nort Caroline Wilmington. She's the director of the Geospatial Intelligence Program and Coastal USAS Observatory. Her research focuses on complex social ecological system dynamics, and much of her work is co-produced with communities, diverse stakeholders in drylands, especially in Eastern and Southern Africa, Peru, and North America. She is also coordinator of the Working Group on Co-production of Sustainable Land Systems, an initiative of the Global Land Program to foster the adoption of co-producing social ecological knowledge within the Global Land Program. I'm very happy to have you here, Narcisa, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Anaí. Thank you. Thank you so much for an awesome presentation. That was definitely taking it to the next level, Josephine. That was very cool. So big shoes to step into, but I figured I will give you an example of a case study that I've been involved with, where interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and co-production has come into play strongly to shape how we address complex problems in socio-ecological systems. So my focus will be just to talk a little bit about that. And thank you for mentioning the Global Land Program. So I have that and Future Earth on here. And I would like to highlight the fact that we have several working groups as part of the Global Land Program. The specific one I've been involved with since about 2018 now is the co-production of sustainable land systems. So I come to this field as a land system scientist working on socio-ecological systems, and a lot of in my field, which is a highly interdisciplinary field by itself, land system science, we definitely pull a lot on transdisciplinary as well, and think a lot about the big sustainability science challenges of our century. And all of this really went back to a paper published by Cates et al. Back in 2001. It's been a while, but we are still kind of grappling with ways to understand the fundamental character of interactions between nature and society, and thinking about ways that we can encourage those interactions to be more sustainable and produce strategies that allow us to drive sustainability science forward and to reconnect research and teaching with the political agenda overall for sustainable development. And I put a little word cloud here. When we think transdisciplinary, we think applied science practice. We think about inclusivity, about participatory, about co-production, stakeholders' knowledge, and co-design. So all of these kind of key factors that come into play. And when we talk transdisciplinary research, we focus on real-world issues that affect that have intra and intergenerational justice components that affect the common good, are by nature, like I said, interdisciplinary, to accommodate the complexity of these systems and have to integrate different perspectives and produce science as a social construct, part of a social learning process. And that science and that knowledge that gets generated is transformative in and of itself. So when do we need transdisciplinary research? I would argue that especially in accomplishing our sustainable development goals, right? We need that science, that bridge between science and practice all the time, because we are looking for complex answers to real life world problems that have a high degree of complexity, uncertainty, and sometimes controversy, right? So that what Josephine was talking about, modulating between our past and our futures and where we are in the present, there is controversy and thinking about the groups and the people and the visions involved. It's kind of a big process. So obviously a lot of different schools of thought are going to have different frameworks of how do we engage in transdisciplinary approaches, whether it's in teaching or in research or in bridging that science and practice. And a lot of it rests on finding these knowledge gaps, being contextually accurate, having the ability to question some of the epistemological assumptions that we've held in the past, and at the same time trying to meet scientific and societal goals to ultimately accomplish whatever common goal or outcome we set out to accomplish. So, and I'll end with this as kind of my overview on what is the ideal type of transdisciplinary research? How do we go about it, right? And Lang et al. In 2012 had this really cool paper that tried to bring it all together, bring together how we frame transdisciplinary research, how we engage in conducting that research, and then on kind of that last end, how we integrate that and that knowledge that was co-created, that was co-produced into science and practice. And there are three, I think, key messages that emerge that to help us kind of tackle these complex problems, and that is collaborative problem framing and the co-design of research projects. That is a critical piece to making transdisciplinary research with real impact and outcomes work, being interdisciplinary in the process of doing so, and then having that constant give and take, that constant science practice collaboration. There's a constant engagement between actors that are specific to different societal discourses that are taking place at any given time. So we can have policymakers, different institutions, NGOs, corporations, private industry, politics, and the media at the table to envision and to co-create these discourses that can actually help us achieve results that are relevant not only to the scientific practice but also the communities. So I'll give you an example of a project or several projects. This kind of pulls on several projects that I've been engaged with, both down in Southern Africa in this region called the Kabango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. Incidentally, the largest transfrontier conservation area in the world, where there are a myriad of complex issues that are being tackled at the interface between social and ecological systems that have impacts on people's livelihoods, on the habitability of those environments, and on wildlife and coexistence of all these pieces together, as well as pulling from experiences up in Eastern Africa, working on similar complex, wicked socio-ecological problems. As I sort of showed with that previous slide with the Lang et al. 2012 paper, a big piece to this is that transdisciplinary knowledge co-production for complex socio-ecological systems requires multiple actors and multiple stakeholders at the table at any given time. So this is a figure we drew on for one of our research projects that just ended in Southern Africa. It was funded by the National Science Foundation. And here we were very much interested in understanding the way that humans affect their environment and the way the environment and changes, long-term changes in the environment are affecting human livelihoods, right? You'd think, well, pretty straightforward, well, not really a straightforward topic, but a big topic where we had to bring at the table social scientists, biophysical scientists, so all of that scientific knowledge. But think about how that scientific knowledge is applied to the to the livelihoods and the management of the natural resources in this region, right? So we had all of these people on the left at the table thinking about advancing not only transdisciplinary knowledge on socio-ecological systems, but combining that knowledge that we as researchers, as interdisciplinary researchers had, and the methods and the tools that we brought to the table with the knowledge and the experience and the tools and the knowledge and the tools that our regional partners and the community end users, the farmers, your park rangers, these community managers had at their tips of their fingers in order to actually have an impact and to really understand these dynamics and support not only that collaborative effort, but the learning that happened between us. And this is why this is kind of it's an iterative process going between all of us multiple times and over multiple sort of field seasons and multiple years in order to understand these dynamics, that everybody was there to really understand how are humans affecting the environment, how are these environmental changes affecting livelihoods, and how can we better, more sustainably manage these resources for positive outcomes for both the environment and humans. So we wrote this paper that was published in 2019 in Society and Natural Resources, thinking about and laying out a process for interdisciplinary collaboration that is happening not only among these multi-actors, so between multiple actors, but very much at multiple scales and multiple levels. So the research we ended up doing there was trying to essentially combine these multi-scalar measurements in socio-ecological systems. Specifically, for instance, we were looking at continental trends in ENSO, in climate trends, right? Drying spells and droughts and things like that, tying those to regional changes in vegetation productivity and how the land systems are changing, and then flying, for example, drones at the field level to understand these really small scale ecological dynamics, tie them into these other scales, and then try to integrate that with the social system scales by looking at policies across the region, then looking at community processes and how they impact how the community is using the land, for example, and then thinking about individual decisions so that we can integrate these different scales to kind of get at the question of how are these human environment interactions panning out, and what implications do they have for the sustainability of these regions and livelihoods in these marginal systems, because these are climatically marginal systems. So we kind of put together this diagram and really highlight the fact that back when we were doing this, co-design and co-production did not happen necessarily at the outset of a project. It was something that we kind of slapped onto it, because in the United States, in North America, up until very recently, the last year or two, no funding agency was necessarily funding that co-production, that engagement from the ground up process. And it's now starting to take on. But even back then, we were talking about how we need to really start engaging at the research co-production phase and do these iterative, adaptive kind of loops through the system at multiple scales, not only spatial scales, right? Spatial scales, but also temporally. So, we have multiple types of research interactions, and to kind of give you an idea, so if you're looking at socio-ecological, so natural human systems, you're looking at things that go from an individual rain event all the way to climate change. How do those kinds of things impact a person, that nation, the community, the household, the individual? And then, I'm sorry, I keep going the wrong direction. And then how does that then impact landscape scale dynamics, a forest, a community, a tree, down to whatever species that of interest you're looking at? And then how do you throw on top of that governance, policies, rules, and all these kinds of things? So it's kind of and it's on purpose complicated and messy like this to highlight the fact that we are dealing with complex problems, and the way to engage and to maybe really make change happen is to tackle these at different levels and different scales. This came out really weird, but we explain this in the paper, kind of how we broke this up by our, specifically for this one example, by project year and all the phases that we went into. And at all times we had these cross-scalar analyses and integrations and collaboration and communication. And ultimately, it was, it all kind of came back to the fact that you're looping through this system, you're looping through connecting the various participants and stakeholders, but that we still have a lot of barriers to doing this kind of work. So there are still difficulties and barriers engaging with these cross-scale and cross-sectoral networks to learn and to act together to address a common goal. There are barriers to cooperation and agreement, right? Like I said before, controversy on some of these futures that we can envision and outcomes that we can envision. There are oftentimes, and we've seen this in all the villages and all the places we've worked, there are important power dynamics and lack of trust that come into play at multiple levels that have to be kind of taken into account and worked through. So that ends up taking a lot more time than we initially think, and then accounting for sources of resilience and sources of uncertainty in these complex and problematic situations. And furthermore, other challenges to combine all of this in one place. And I'll give you an example of what we were able to kind of find with these types of engagements in TDR. So we do need to approach these systems, right, from a socio-ecological system perspective, whether we're envisioning future land use plans or whether we're envisioning future cities, right? It all is a socio-ecological system problem. But how do we structure the research design so that the analytical approach unfolds iteratively and at multiple scales? Because we have to do this many times over and engage with different actors and different stakeholders that are responsible for managing or being a part or an actor in the different scales. How do we structure research questions and approaches with the appropriate terminology that has commonalities across disciplines and different levels of participation? That's always it's a big challenge to think about. And how do we resolve disparate methodological approaches to envision common futures with common outcomes and goals that, to create a statistical model, it's hard enough in and of itself, right, to tackle these things and combine them, but to go beyond that, that still remains a challenge. And I'll give you a quick example how all of this kind of came together. This is a paper literally coming out this week, where we did all of that I kind of just described, all of the multi-level, multi-actor, biophysical. So we included biophysical estimates from remote sensing and from time series analysis of climate and vegetation into an exposure component over here. And then we did over 700 surveys in this one 3-country area, the Transfrontier Conservation Area. So we had a lot of sort of metrics for an index of adaptive capacity, because we were, again, trying to understand that human environment interaction in and back and forth. we had information about crops and sensitivity of those systems, and we were ultimately trying to understand how livelihoods are being affected by environmental changes and kind of the other way. So we parameterized that in a food security kind of direction. And so all of this to say that we ended up learning that if you bring all of that stuff together, exposure, so environmental covariates and the distance to the floodplain and how much people crop and their adaptive capacity and all of that adaptive capacity. So basically the one place where we have a lot of leverage to make things or to equip people to better deal with environmental changes and extremes is the strongest mediator of household vulnerability. So that gives us, this really critical thing we can hold in our hand and say, hey, there's something we can actually do and envision a different future. But when we looked at the data across years, and this is a whole other paper also that is about to come out, we were able to compare our surveys to a survey in 1995, and we actually saw that people were not better off 20-some, almost 30 years later, by looking at these surveys over time, than they were in 1995. So that begs a lot of questions of, again, are we doing everything we can to engage in the right way in these transdisciplinary projects to really affect what matters, and that's people's livelihoods. And so that's really all I wanted to share today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Narcisa, for sharing with us the intricate and elaborate methods.
Sorry, I went over time.
No worries. In which we can really put into practice some of these ideas. I'm also very excited about learning that you were working with adaptive capacity, which is also my line of research. We are going to have our final guest speaker here from Chile, imported from Italy, but living in Chile. Marco Billi is assistant professor at the Faculty of Agronomic Sciences at the University of Chile. He went from economic sciences into a PhD in political processes and institutions. And he has been exploring transdisciplinary sciences co-production from theory, but also in practice. He's a principal researcher in different projects that includes inter and transdiscipline, and is member of different networks such as the Climate and Resilience Center, the Center of Transdisciplinary Systemic Studies, and is coordinator of the NITES group, the Research Center in Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary for Higher Education here at the university. He will tell us more about the work we are doing and the challenges we're facing in order to open this conversation to the public and between us. Go ahead, Marco.
Thanks, Anaí. And well, first of all, even before I start, I want to thank you a lot, Josie and Narcisa. Your presentation was so interesting. I was fascinated. I would just love to just speak about that and have a conversation about those topics. But I've been asked to also make a presentation of my own, so I will hold my questions which I have for after the presentation. In my case, as Anaí was saying, I have been doing inter and transdisciplinary research in several fields, and in fact there are several things that we do that have to do with futures on the one hand, or with multi-scale socio-ecological analysis on the other. So I pretty much empathize with the same challenges that you have. But now in my presentation, I will focus on what we do at the University of Chile, particularly some experiences that we have with with some research hubs that we have been having here at the university. So I will, first of all, say a little bit of context about the inter and transdisciplinarity at the University of Chile, how we've been tackling it, some experiences and reflections that we'll be having. And then I will go to two specific applications. One is about applying interdiscipline through what we call the NES initiative. We'll talk a little bit about that and our experiences, and studying interdiscipline through the NITES hub. And then some final remarks, which are pretty much about challenges and lessons learned and how do we go from here. So within the University of Chile, the interdisciplinarity is something which has been increasingly taken up as part of the mission of the institution. But in fact, the law itself states that the state university must promote the formation of interdisciplinary work teams. It doesn't really necessarily say how we do it, but it says that we have to do it. And then the university itself has put interdisciplinarity within the educational model and its institutional strategic plan. So it's something that has been going on as how do we tackle it? As a result, during the last years, we have been making some exercises that through the same work teams that we have here, particularly to the NITES hub, which I will tell you about in a bit more time, we have been facilitating some debates about what do we mean and why should we tackle interdisciplinarity within the university. And we have had they're kind of interesting workshops because basically they are interdisciplinary workshops to discuss about interdisciplinarity and how do we tackle it. And so there was a double exercise here of reflection. Some interesting things came over, and actually we had a publication on this because it turned out that there are very different views within interdisciplinarity itself, and within understanding of interdisciplinarity are very different, not only in terms of what do we understand by interdisciplinarity, but also why do we think we need it, what do we think the university should do in terms of it. And particularly we encountered three, one which was very much connected with the idea of innovation. So interdiscipline has a way to foster something new, which is very much connected with the original idea of transdiscipline. So creating a new discipline, creating something more complex by itself, because science can advance in that way. Then there is another one which is very much connected with the idea of engagement and the connection between science and the public, which is not the same. In fact, there are many people that are totally in pro of interdisciplinarity, but not in pro of including external stakeholders. And then it's where you have, also the ideological divides. And then there is a broader debate about the need of reforming the institutions to foster that, but also in some way the idea of what's the role of the educational and university itself within this whole debate. Now, based on all of that, we did advance towards some definitions that were in fact included within the university and also within the National Agency of Research and Development. In fact, this same figure that is here, this was made through the work that we did. So through some of these workshops, then it was included in the policy, and it wasn't also included in the national policy. You can find pretty much the same thing exactly in the NITES recommendation about what is an interdisciplinary study. And basically the idea is that interdiscipline is something which is in a continuum between a discipline which kind of opens up, which kind of specializes, but then opens up towards some other disciplines. And then when you get to transdisciplinarity, you're basically creating a new field and possibly a new discipline towards that. And so you have evolution and probably a cycle between disciplines creating and then specializing and then differentiating again during the process. Now, within the university itself, we have several experiences that we've been making, both in education and research. Within research, we have within the Vice Directorate of Research and Development, there is a network, a department in charge of networks, and all of these networks are inherently interdisciplinary. So we have several networks that have been creating this far. There is another one, which is the Red P here below, which was created within this, and then it was made independent, and it's now working by itself. And also the NITES that I was talking about was creating within this same framework. We have some other experiences within education, so under another space within the institution of the university. And then we have some experiences which cannot be really classified as either education or research. They came from the bottom up and they tried to find their own space. And sometimes it's very difficult to find a space within the institution that tries to classify you, but doesn't really know where they can classify you. So this is a little bit about the university in itself. Now we'll get into detail about these two last experiences that are here below, NAS and NEST, because they are nice experiences of what we do in terms of practicing interdisciplinarity and studying interdisciplinarity. So ENEAS is an initiative which was funded as a network, a transdisciplinary network focused on energy, water, and sustainability. We have several academics, and we have been growing in doing several things associated with developing, articulating, or promoting the research initiatives, teaching efforts, and also connecting with the environment. We have been, as you can see, quite interdisciplinary in the field, but of course, this does not mean that we are equally represented in all spaces. Physical and mathematical sciences do, and also architecture and urbanism seem to be much more prone to enter this kind of space at the beginning, also partly because that's maybe of the kinds of topics that were where it was at the beginning built, like were the people that were entering these at the beginning. And then, of course, there are some spaces such as social sciences, which have been sometimes leading the very debate, even if they're not necessarily the ones who are like more in terms of number, but sometimes they do take a role in facilitating the very interdisciplinary debate between the network. Now, the network has done several things. I won't go over all of them, but one nice thing that we want to highlight is that now we're creating the first minor, which is a specific minor in transdiscipline for sustainability, which has been created in the university and will be dictated starting next semester. And it's quite interesting, both as an experience of doing this and as an advance for the university proper, in trying to not only talk about interdisciplinarity, but actually doing that, incorporating that into its research programs. We did find out it's quite easier to actually do that in new courses than in existing ones, because when you try to do interdisciplinarity in existing spaces of education, it's quite complicated, because then you had to deal with existing norms and structure, and it's quite easier when you actually build something new, but it's also a challenge for advancing on this, of course. Then, of course, we made several activities in terms of both workshops to talk about this. There's lots of discussion about how do you connect interdisciplinarity with sustainable development goals, and how do you connect sustainable development goals within the university itself. So, of course, NAS has been a little bit leading this debate, connecting with some other important institutions that have been starting to work on sustainability within the university. So this is about how some experiences of how we do this. And interesting enough, NAS is definitely not the only space that has been working on this. There are other spaces that have been doing pretty much the same thing at the same time. So there is also, and that's why I also was saying at the beginning that sometimes when you do interdisciplinarity, you end up building a new border, a new boundary. So you are trying to break the boundaries, but necessarily, since the world is too complex, you also create another boundary, another network of scholars with some approaches, and then you have to another interdisciplinary exercise of making different interdisciplinary spaces this debate one to the other. And of course, this is like a never-ending experience, such as democracy itself in some way. So since we do know that, we don't only try to do it, but we also try to build a reflection space for interdisciplinarity, and that's how the NITES hub was built. So the hub has been built as a space which is embedded, like fostered by the Vice-Rectorate of Research and Development, but it's also partly independent, and it's like a nucleus for studying how do we do interdisciplinarity within the university and in other spaces to try and systematize good practices for these, and of course write publications, but also position learnings on this within Chile, and of course with an overlook to Latin America. So we have been working, of course, in transdisciplinary and knowledge co-production, quality, and how do you study quality in higher education going beyond the classical paradigm of assessment? How do you transform university, or do you understand the transformation of university? And of course, the connection that I was saying before between interdisciplinarity and sustainability. So we have been working within the university, but a lot also at the interface between the university and other spaces, and between the university and networks of university access in Chile. For instance, we have been doing a survey that was made within the university to try and understand the challenges just doing interdisciplinarity within the University of Chile, and then the same survey was replicated in other universities. And then we're trying to take some lessons learned, cross over all these different experiences. And also we have been studying how research initiatives proper that have been advancing interdisciplinarity in Chile, what are the challenges that have been faced, but also what did they learn and how can this be used by the Ministry of Science, for instance, to foster new research programs in the future. Well, this is the coordination team. We have, of course, an academic committee, which has been recently renewed, and a coordination team, both in terms of management and of comms. We're not very big, and we are not very well funded either. And I'm saying this because this is also one big challenge that you find when you do these kind of things, that like everybody wants interdisciplinarity, but nobody wants to pay for it. And so this is also something that you always find. So it was very interesting to listen to you before, like how it was starting to be embedded, for instance, in research programs, that they start embedding this from the start, because otherwise it's something that you have to do on top of everything else, and it becomes quite complex. So here are some things that we did in terms of technical methodological support within the University of Chile and outside participatory activities. And we made lots of effort in trying and helping in articulating the different courses. In a previous slide, I was showing the different interdisciplinary courses that the university does. Most of those courses are somehow supported or coordinated by people that participate either in NITES or NITES, or both of them. Also point you to another point. In the end, interdisciplinarity, we're always the same people going around and making lots of noise, but it's not that big of a network as one would like to think. And this connects me with the final remarks, which I will try to do in 1.5 minutes, so I am in my allotted time. And the point is, there is no need to say it, but let's say it, doing interdisciplinary is hard, and sometimes this difficulty is understated or underrepresented in when you build the programs, both research program or education. And it's only harder for who does it, but also who has to take advantage for it. For instance, I have seen lots of education programs who want to be interdisciplinary, and the only thing they actually achieve is that they become much more challenging for any students wanting to do them, because in the end, the charge of doing the connections is brought to the student instead than to the professors themselves, and this is something that happens too often. Of course, there are things that work and things that don't, so there is an urgency of systematizing and sharing experiences. One thing that always happens in all our debates and workshops is that we also start saying, okay, but we need to know who's doing interdiscipline and what is being done. We have to start from there. And there are not usually those many databases to show this kind of experiences. Also, the question of, I said before, about who does it, how to get from, we are the new kids in the block, everybody likes it, but we are in fact just 3-4 people doing this, to actually mainstreaming this in all research and education activities. This is a big challenge. There is also another challenge, which is how interdisciplinary is interdisciplinary practice. So yeah, maybe interdisciplinary, but do all the disciplines really participate in that? Do some disciplines have more power or more participation than other? When do we study interdisciplinary? Are we studying this from an interdisciplinary perspective? So are we falling back, for instance, in doing sociological studies of interdiscipline, for instance? There is this big debate between interdiscipline versus transdiscipline that I was showing before, which is also an ideological debate on what do we understand by the meaning of science, and the connection between science and policy. There is the connection between interdisciplinary and sustainability, which needs to be, it's always at the beginning of this, but needs to be also understood more. What's also interdisciplinary, like, is there interdisciplinary without sustainability debate? Can we actually separate the debates, or do we have to make them together? There is a clash of cultures or a clash of incentives. This is a very good question. So the point is that institutional may, so we don't have enough incentives, or is that we are too dull and we don't want to change as individuals or as groups? This is also a nice question that has not really been answered so well. There is the question of the chicken and the egg. So should we deinstitutionalize interdiscipline and wait for this to be an institution, or should we do it and then it will be institutionalized later? Of course, there are good and bad points about either of those. And in synthesis, my point is that interdiscipline is here now to remain, but it's also a crossroad. And so we do need this interdisciplinary debate to better define whether we want to move it forward. So thank you.
Gracias, Marco. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, three of you, for your presentations. Now, I leave the mic open for questions or the chat. There are many of us here. If anybody wants to start, or I can start to warm up. Okay, ¿algún question? I want to start with one question because there were so many ideas from both Josie and Narcisa that I was trying to connect to our own experience with Marco and the rest of the team, not only trying to do research, but also trying to start to educate with those ideas in order to have the next generation of professionals that are more prone to engage with other researchers. And Narcisa, you mentioned that in order to do the interdisciplinarity, you have to question epistemological assumptions. And at the same time, Josie, you mentioned the idea that predictability is boring. That's why you have engaged with art. So those two ideas are very engaging in the things we do. But my experience also is that when you bring uncertainty, both decision makers but also students don't receive it very well. So where that comes from, how can we engage in this idea of breaking what we know or doing differently in order to achieve the changes we want or the transformations we want? Marco also helped me with answering this.
I can tell the thing I didn't say in my presentation is that the team of us that actually conducted this research project, specifically the one I was referencing the most, we were all trained at the University of Florida in a highly interdisciplinary program. So we were part of an interdisciplinary PhD program, and we were, coming back to your question on assumptions and futures and uncertainty, we were essentially tasked with having to develop a project that is anchored in our respective disciplines, but there were, in that cohort, there were students from economics, law, math and stats, a lot of different fields, but we were tasked with grappling with the question of watershed and adaptive management of our water systems. So that was the theme for everybody to engage around, but come at it from these different perspectives. So the whole program was structured around a theme, a common theme that is obviously very applied, very impactful, related to sustainability, and that we were coming at it from these different perspectives, and that being essentially forced to take an interdisciplinary approach and think of, and question our epistemological assumptions. Because what I think, or how I thought you would engage, is not how an anthropologist would come to the table and say you should engage. So in thinking about, and that was it's a small example, but it was a whole cohort-like experience that we could potentially design a minor or a project around, and sort of have a theme or envision a different future with these different perspectives.
Yeah, maybe just to add to what Narcisa said, I completely agree with you that just the value of when you have many different perspectives in the same room, and there's the space to really kind of surface and see those differences, the power of seeing multiple perspectives, which naturally happens when you're part of these collaborative processes, when you're just kind of forced to engage with these differences. I think you ask a really interesting question about uncertainty, because I do think that we often have this tendency to want to make things more certain than they are, to make us feel more comfortable. And it's quite uncomfortable to go into a process and keep things very open. And so, yeah, I guess one way I've kind of approached that is really to show the limits of certainty. So when we do pin down particular assumptions about how we see the world, actually show examples of how that's really hindered different perspectives, has caused injustices, has really limited the way that we can transform collectively. And so I think the balance of showing the limits of certainty, but then also creating space for multiple perspectives and showing people how you can engage with uncertainty. So different even methodological approaches for creating and holding those spaces, I think can help people, give people a sense of how they can be more comfortable or hold that space. And maybe just to give one quick example of that, I think like the PhD course that you mentioned earlier, Nachi, on transformative research, that whole process creates space for different researchers from very different disciplinary backgrounds to verbalize on paper how they see their role as a researcher and why do they think, like, what is it about what they do in research that they think is going to connect to societal transformation. And once having all that explicit kind of going into the course, you see all these really kind of different perspectives. And then part of the course, I think, helps people to not just like shut down with that discomfort of thinking, oh, I might be wrong, but actually create that safe space to open up and really question those different perspectives. So I think, and then in that course, people have come out with kind of very different narratives of their understanding of their potential role. And I think if we only had that like questioning, then you might feel kind of disempowered or like, oh, okay, I'm wrong, but what do I do from here? So also kind of engaging with all sorts of alternatives, I think helps inspire people in terms of how they can do things differently.
If I may add to that, so I think in general, uncertainty as everything, but you very much need to think exactly where you are and what's your public. I think it's in some way easier and very much convenient to insert uncertainty within teaching, within particular, within university spaces of teaching, particularly both undergraduate and postgraduate, because you are in a way helping to create a culture and a capacity of thinking in terms of uncertainty, or thinking in terms of future. The point is, what do you do when you are in spaces which are nearer to, which are not so much protected as university spaces, for instance? Because in the end, students, they have lots of things, but they are protected. They still have time to learn. They are not making decisions directly with this. I think one of the points when you make particularly transdisciplinary research is that when you are speaking with people that they're living in very different worlds, in which uncertainty may mean, if I speak of uncertainty in a meeting of a board of director of a very big company, and they take this for granted, this means a certainty of millions of dollars lost because of their stocks to fall. And if I speak of uncertainty in the parliament, it just means that very likely the other party will win, because then we will push, and that's what happened. Populism is part of the reason that we have so much populism around, is that because there are so many uncertainties and people stick to certainties because they cannot understand them. So we need to help building this ability to understand and live with uncertainty, but at the same time, we cannot overexpose people to uncertainty when they're not ready for it, because then you can just disrupt everything. So this balance, I think, is very complicated, and it requires, as always, that there is not one approach for everything. You have to find a solution, co-construct a solution with the people that you need to expose interdisciplinarity and uncertainty to.
Thank you, Marco. Matías, ¿quieres hacer tu pregunta?
Okay. I was just thinking that we usually value very positively what we win when we do interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work, but also we lose some things as well. And I wanted to ask, like, what in your experience, what do you lose when you approach futures or socio-ecological systems in a transdisciplinary way? Like, what do you miss from disciplinary work when you're doing this kind of complex, you know, intricate efforts to do something differently? For
I can
any of you, all of you.
Jump in first. I'm sure everyone has something to say here. Yeah, it's an excellent question. It makes me think of Maria Lemos's paper to co-produce or not to co-produce or not to co-produce. That is the question, or something like that. Which I think shares some interesting insights, especially around how we often kind of put co-production or transdisciplinarity on a pedestal and a halo around it. But there's just so much time and effort that goes in. Like, anyone that's done this sort of work knows that it's just a massive amount of time and effort that's oftentimes not sufficiently rewarded in the system. So I've also been asking myself this question of, where do I need to be a little bit less collaborative? And I think it's a tricky balance, because if you really kind of focus on getting the narratives or the messages out there, or studying what you want to, that certainly has a particular power, but it all depends on the framing ultimately that you're going with, and what sort of power relations is that enabling or questioning. And I think if one decides that all on their own, they're fundamentally limited based on kind of their previous biases. But then at the same time, if you're always kind of co-designing everything, it takes forever. So I suppose I'm in favor of a bit of an iterative process between opening up at certain points, but then to make things practical and really to advance certain agendas, also kind of closing down. I'm still not fully certain on when makes sense to open up and close down, but I also think we need our university systems to be much more supportive of those attempts to open up, because I think that's not sufficiently valued at the moment. But it's a good question. I know, yeah, there are definitely additional things that are lost, so I'll keep thinking about it, and maybe additional things will pop up as Narcisa and Marco also respond.
And I guess I would definitely echo what you're talking about. And this is actually one of the things I'm working on at my university, is thinking about new reward and incentive strategies for this kind of work, because it's not valued in the same way that a paper that you do by yourself as lead author is valued. I mean, that's, but your question, I thought maybe, are you also thinking that perhaps sometimes you lose focus because you have so many voices, and then you get a lot of controversy? Do you lose people? Do you lose messages? Do you lose how heard everybody feels in the process? I don't know. Maybe that's gets lost there in translation to some extent, I would think, because you do have to make compromises. And when you do compromise, you may have to shift the focus of one direction or one outcome to accommodate for something else, for somebody who's being more vocal, more, you might also lose women if it's a man-dominated conversation. We've seen this, right? We've had to make explicit efforts to make sure that we've had to do separate focus groups with women to get their perspectives, because if you bring women and men to the table in this way across multiple levels of, say, management or who's being represented, say if you have different people at the table, there might be that power relation that prevents some people from speaking up and having their voices heard. So you will lose a lot of perspectives in that way. But yes, it's a great question, and definitely something I need to think about more, because we do think that this is the answer to all of our problems. Maybe it isn't.
The only thing I would add to that, I think both Josie and Narcisa gave very, very good answers to very complicated questions. One thing that I may add is that, and here just because sometimes I do remember that very a very long time ago, I was an economist before anything else, and before I kind of lost track of what my discipline was. So sometimes I do remember scarcity and trade-offs. And point is, unless you have unlimited time, resources, and people that you don't usually have, there is always a trade-off between, I would say, breadth against depth. So like, if you want to cover 10 different dimensions, which are part of different disciplines, then you don't have the time to go in depth in each of them. And that applies to research and applies to education. You cannot train a poor student in 10 disciplines. What you train them is in a little bit of everything, but then they don't really know in detail each of those disciplines. They cannot do both. One of the reasons when you start when I do classes of interdisciplinarity to my students, I always start with discipline, because I want them to understand why did we start doing disciplines in the first place. It's not just because we were stupid people that wanted to do things that won't work. It's because there was a reason, because the world is very complex, and we wanted to find ways to create a disciplines for our looking at things, to create norms and rules. And then maybe we got a little bit overtaken. So now we have too many disciplines and we are too much differentiated, but there was a reason behind it, so we don't have to lose track of it. And so sometimes if you open to many disciplines, you still don't necessarily want to have all of them, unless you have enough time, enough money to pay for that, enough research people. Because, for instance, one thing that happens in the CR2 in one of our research centers is that there are some, you don't really have the time to debate. Like, you don't know what methodology to use to do a survey. There is simply nobody to speak with, because you're the only person expert in doing surveys. So if you want to know that, you have to go and search colleagues in some other places, but you cannot debate it there because there are not other people experts on them. And so this is something that you may lose.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Josie. We have very few minutes. We have already lost half of the of the people who was watching here in YouTube. Lunchtime probably. So Marco, you had one question for our guest?
I did have a question for the specific topics that both Josie and Narcisa were talking about. Like, apart this very interesting conversation about interdisciplinary overall, but for Josie, what very interesting everything about your approach to future making, everything you are and future studying and all that about the future. As I said before, we work on that a little bit, so we are very much interested on that. One point of that, which I think is very much related with the question about the uncertainty, is that when you make a future, like an anticipatory exercise, you're kind of opening, the world. You're kind of, opening up possibilities. But then in some spaces, you just want to close down that contingency. And when you talk about the past and injustices, it does also seem that it kind of closes down a little bit, because you don't want to say, oh, there may be injustice. You want to say those are the injustices. So how do you balance between this opening up and closing down? And to Narcisa, so since you have multiple skills and you have multiple kinds of stakeholders that work on those skills, and you have multiple levels of abstraction. So, you talk at the global scale, you cannot get into detail, and vice versa. So how do you frame more than to build your understanding, how do you frame your results for the different publics at the different scales so that it is relevant to them?
Great. Do you want to go first, Narcisa, or shall I go first? Okay. Yeah, great. No, that's such a good question. I think that's a really fascinating tension. And I think also is why certain movements that tend to engage more with the past and the future often kind of become disconnected in their approach. So with movements that are very strong in decolonization, they do tend to be more past focused and more set on kind of setting a very particular agenda. Whereas if you look at Afrofuturism or other kinds of kind of more distant into the future that are kind of opening up, these could be possibilities that are very disconnected from the present, you don't see, and maybe now we are seeing more of this, but I feel like we've been very slow to kind of see a connection between those different orientations. And I guess when it comes to, it's interesting because I think with a lot of the work that we're doing, we're trying to kind of open up imagination of possible futures. But I would still say that almost the dominant way that a lot of people engage with the future is kind of closing it down because it's so driven, like with dominant policymakers or even dominant kind of research or kind of very traditional research perspectives have such kind of clear ideas about what the right way is to do things that in a way there's that implicit closing down oriented towards the future that's not necessarily recognized. So I think it's really interesting to think about how do we kind of link more in our approach past, present, and future. And I think some approaches that try to do that, just one that comes to mind is theater of the oppressed, which I'm not sure are, and for anyone, just in case anyone's not so familiar with that approach. So you're kind of, so people who are experiencing oppressive relations and really want to change existing problems, step into, they almost kind of like act out that configuration, which feels like a deadlock and feels very constrained through theatrical techniques. So it's kind of recognizing those challenges, but then using creative theatrical techniques to experiment with, okay, well, how could this be very different if we change our roles or configuration? How could we actually kind of break out of these challenges or these systems of oppression? And so I think that's one example of a methodology that tries to link both to the struggles and really kind of acknowledge those injustices and really foreground people into roles where they would experiment with also kind of completely different alternatives. But I think we really need to experiment with different forms of connecting a past orientation and a future one.
And thank you for the question on how we communicate the various components and aspects and findings of that research to different levels. We've actually specifically what we've done multiple ways of communicating what we found and what all that engagement and all the workshops and all the collection. So I put in the chat an example story map. We kind of created that as a high level overview of the project, easily understood. We created policy briefs for the decision makers that we had engaged with, and we sent each policymaker, each Department of Wildlife and National Parks, or whoever it was that we had engaged with, a policy brief summarizing the findings. And then we were lucky that we saved some money in the grant and did dissemination roadshow, so to speak. And so we made these very simple and down to earth visuals like posters, and we took them back to the villages that we had conducted surveys and data collection in and sat people down at one of their community. We sat down at one of the existing community meetings and we explained in very simple terms what we had found. So we did like these multiple levels, targeted different types of communication products. And I think that's probably the way to do it, because one size does not fit all, obviously.
Thanks both. Very nice answer.
Yeah, but thank you all so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Josie and Narcisa and Marco, for being here and sharing with us everything that you are doing in terms of research and teaching and thinking about how we move from our papers into real world, into real connections. It's exciting times for us that we have been taught in interdiscipline and trying to think how we move forward. In the name of the University of Chile, we are very thankful for your presence here, and we hope to be open to any communication and help and any idea that you would love to share with us. Muchas gracias y quedamos abiertos a cualquier comunicación, interacción. Estamos muy felices de poder compartir lo que hacemos y aprender de lo que ustedes vienen haciendo en sus universidades. Muchas gracias, Marco.
Muchas gracias por la
Muchísimas gracias.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Italiani.
Grazie mille.